Number 6.
The year is 2003. I am a 15-year-old boy and living in a small city. This is a place where everyone seems to know everyone. I am typically shy and often use the internet as a way to meet people. During this time, the instant messenger ICQ was still pretty popular amongst the teens in my area. I would often stay up late adding new people and chatting them up. I would do this by searching by city and adding people I knew from school. This is how I met her. Her name was Sarah. We began chatting innocently enough, the normal "hey, what's up" sort of deal. Now, Sarah was a self-described 17-year-old girl, short, brown hair and nerdy. We hit it off pretty fast. We had so much in common and I found it easy to open up to her. Although I thought it was strange that I had never seen her in school. I go to a Christian school, explaining why I had never seen her. We continue chatting for some time and I eventually give her my phone number. We chat regularly over the phone until eventually she asks, "Would you like to hang out sometime?" Without hesitation, we make plans for me to go over to her house and hang out and watch movies. The day finally comes for us to hang out. I make my way across town to the address she gave me. It's a small apartment building. Slightly confused on how she and the rest of her family would fit in such a small apartment, I make my way up the stairs. I knock and I am immediately greeted at the door by a woman, maybe in her late 20s or early 30s. I knew that this was Sarah, but she didn't look anything like she described. I was instantly weirded out but followed her into a small one-bedroom apartment. I stupidly asked, "So, are your parents home?" She laughed. "No, it's just me here." I am now sitting awkwardly on the couch. "Do you drink?" She's looking at me across the room. "Water?" I joke. We both share an awkward laugh as she pours me a glass of wine. I never take a sip of it. She sits close to me after popping on a bootleg copy of Finding Nemo. My brother got this for me while it was still in theaters. He's like a hacker or something. At this point, she is very close to me. I am uncomfortable and being the weirdo I am, I shift to the floor. I am now sitting on the floor with my back up against the couch. She then straddles me from behind. "You look so tense." She begins rubbing my back. "I'm really good at this. I can make you feel so good." I lean forward. "Thanks, but you don't need to do that. Seriously, I'm fine." I explain that I should be going. She points to her bedroom. "You can stay the night. I've never had a guy stay in my bed." She keeps making sexual advances, telling me how she hasn't had sex in so long and she just wants to meet a nice guy like me. All the while, she keeps touching my arms and face. Now, at this point in my life, I was still a virgin, but this lady was not going to be the one to change that. I talk my way out of the situation and head home. The next few days, I get several messages telling me that she misses me and she's sorry. Eventually, I cave and respond to one of her messages. I ask her why she lied and what her deal is. She tells me she has a hard time meeting friends and that she doesn't like people her own age. I feel bad and forgive her, and we make plans to talk in person. So, here I am at my last encounter with Sarah. I ride my bike to her apartment. Once inside, I am greeted not only by her but by her parents. They introduce themselves. Finally, we get to meet Sarah's boyfriend. Her dad jokes, "We've heard so much about you. She's always going on about how great you are." Her mum follows up. In my head, I'm freaking out. I am not this girl's boyfriend. Sarah grabs my hand and laces our fingers. She looks so happy. Her parents are just stopping over to pick something up and were actually on their way out the door when I showed up. If I was going to get out of here, now would be the chance. I grabbed the box her mum was about to pick up. "I'll take that down for you." Her mum smiles. "You're a keeper." I help her parents load the box in their SUV and hop on my bike. I was just swinging by to say hi. I should probably get home. Sarah wraps her arms around me and kisses my cheek. I ride home confused and plan on never talking to that girl again. She dropped me a few messages I never responded to. She called the landline a few times, but we never spoke. I don't know whatever happened to her, and I don't know why her parents didn't question my age, or were they just okay with it?
Number 5.
This happened while I was in the 11th grade. I'm a female and tend to be a people pleaser. I never like to call anyone out, reject anyone outright, or act like someone is weird. I'm also a bit open-minded and tend to go with the flow. School had started in early September, and in my marine biology class, I noticed that this boy kept staring at me from the corner of my eye. I just made one of those half smiles towards him to acknowledge him, and went on about my assignment. I really did not think much of it for a couple of weeks, even though he continued to stare. He was very skinny and tall, had brown hair, eyes that were so brown that they could have been black, and a generally nondescript face other than his super dark eyes. One day, he decided to say hi. I said hello back to him. He told me his name, which was Alex. I told him mine, but he said that he already knew my name. That's not a surprise, as I have rather large handwriting, and he could have easily watched me write my name on my papers since he was staring at me so much. It was just kind of odd that he didn't really have any facial expression when he flatly said that he knew my name. I just laughed a little, said okay, and began putting my things back into my bag as the bell was about to ring. I only had a few friends and we always sat at the same table during lunch. We were rather quiet and most times read while we ate. This means I don't usually look around the lunchroom as I have my eyes on my book. This day, my friend finished her novel, so I decided to put mine away and we could just talk. I immediately noticed Alex staring inside at us from the courtyard tables. He never seemed to be embarrassed that I noticed him. I showed him to my friend and told her about my class with him. She found it to be super creepy, but I said he's probably harmless and just socially awkward. I arrived in marine biology a little earlier that day, and so it was just myself, Alex, and one other girl for about 10 minutes. I half smiled at Alex, and then I decided to break out my book and start reading again. He had his hands up, folded over his mouth, and was staring again. At this time, it just felt awkward because we were basically alone now. I glanced over at him and kind of raised my eyebrows a little, as if to say, yes? He looked me up and down, very slowly, and I just asked him if he was okay. He said yes, and that he was just inside of his head, thinking, okay, whatever, that's fine I guess. The next day at lunch, there was a little piece of paper on the table that we sat at that had my name on the front, but not just my first name, my first and middle name. I opened it and it said something like, I wonder what your asshole would look like with a thick PVC pipe shoved up it. What the fuck? I looked around, but didn't see Alex. I immediately knew it was him. I was really scared to come to class later that day, but he wasn't there. I felt a lot better about not seeing him. The note itself was gross and embarrassing. I didn't want to show any administrators because of that. I just threw it out. I went to the bus area at the end of the day like usual, but this time I noticed Alex leaning on one of the pillars with his backpack on one shoulder. I literally felt chills down my spine when I noticed a white PVC pipe poking out of the top of his backpack through the zippers. I didn't give him any reaction to my knowledge, even though I'm sure he was watching me read the note. The next morning, I made an appointment with a counselor and had my class changed. She was very reluctant to do that for me because we were already into the school year well over a month and a half. But I think since I have a history of good grades and behavior, she helped me out. I spent the rest of the year avidly avoiding him. He kept staring at lunchtime, and one time he took photos of me at the bus area without my consent. Even though it was against school policy, I got some pepper spray for when I get off at my bus stop. I have no clue what happened to him because when 12th grade began, he was no longer at our school. I'm not sure if I even want to know how he turned out.
Number 4.
About 4 years ago, I lived in a college town while my husband attended the university there. I had 2 small daughters, a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old, and we loved the city. It was super family friendly and had a ton of great places for me to spend time with my kids. One of these places was a public library. The children's section was secluded from the rest of the building, so the kids were free to run and play without disturbing anyone. There were toys and puppet shows, a huge train set, and an awesome prince's castle. My kids loved it, so we hung out there at least twice a week. One morning, I loaded my kiddos up and headed to the library. My 2-year-old was playing with the castle, her favorite, while I held the 6-month-old a few feet away. A woman approached me, gushing about how cute my baby was. I was pretty used to this. My daughter was a stunning baby. Big brown eyes, dark ringlets, and the chubbiest cheeks ever. People always came up to me, cooing at her. But this woman was different. My mummy senses started going off. I got a pit in my stomach and was immediately put on edge. She stood way too close to me and was touching my baby girl way too much. She was pinching her cheeks and rubbing her head, grabbing her little hands and kissing her, inching closer and closer all the while. She kept saying, "Oh, I just love babies. She's so pretty. I just love her," in this sort of manic, sing-song voice. I kept trying to put a little distance between us, but she wouldn't have it, always inching closer. Then she started asking to hold her. I immediately made excuses. "She's pretty tired. We need to go soon. She's really attached to me. She'll just cry." Looking back, I wish I had just told her to leave us alone. But I was nervous and didn't know what she was trying to do, so I defaulted to politeness. After a moment or two, my baby dropped her binky onto the floor, and the woman stooped down to grab it for me. But instead of just handing it to me, she put it in her mouth, supposedly to clean it off, then tried to pop it back into my daughter's mouth. I snatched it and told her I needed to go. She said, "Oh please, let me hold the baby before you go." I obviously told her no and started trying to get my older daughter's attention so that we could leave. The woman then said, "Oh, I just love babies. I just can't help it," and grabbed my daughter from my arms. She then started inching away from me. By this point, I was petrified and furious. I firmly said, "Give me back my child," lunged for her, and grabbed my baby back. I had to practically push her away from me. She had started scooting closer again as soon as the baby was out of her arms. I grabbed my older girl and hightailed it out of the building, hoping to escape as fast as I could. As I approached my car, I realized that the woman had followed us out to the parking lot. She was still gushing. "Oh, you have 2 beautiful babies." I felt sick to my stomach. I realized that while I was buckling the baby into her seat, my 2-year-old would be standing next to me, where this crazy woman could potentially grab her. and sure enough, she was inching closer and closer to us every second. I was certain at this point that she was going to try and steal one of my kids. I was shaking and close to tears, but my adrenaline kicked in and I was somehow able to pick up both kids and buckle them safely into the car without letting go of them. As I was pulling away, I watched the woman in my rearview mirror. She just stood there in the parking lot, watching my car until we were out of sight. I didn't go back to the library for a long time after that.
Number 3.
I'm writing this because I just had another nightmare, and I don't know what else to do. I understand by paying attention to this, I may be making things worse, but this is something I just can't keep to myself anymore. Okay, so I'll start from the beginning. My name is Danielle and I'm 22 years old. I've been very close to my grandparents since birth. They're very gentle, kind Christian folk. I used to be so attached to them that I would stay with them for long periods of time. The house they lived in has never had any deaths in it, but it's haunted. Very haunted. I blame my uncle. He's called things into the home. He thought it would be funny, but it's not funny. These things are evil. I would sleep on the couch and hear scratching on the arm of it next to my head, and it would sometimes sound like people were in the kitchen. Doors would open and close. Once, I remember I was sitting in the living room with my uncle, watching cartoons and drawing, when he says, "Hey, around 10 p.m. last night, all of the doorknobs in the house turned at the same time." I tried to ignore him because I didn't want to hear it. It was already 9:50 p.m. "You don't have to believe me, but I swear to you, as soon as it was 10, every doorknob in the house sounded like it was grabbed, turned, and let go. It was loud and aggressive." I wanted so badly to believe that my uncle was playing some sort of prank, but deep down I knew something was wrong. A lot of times I would sleep with my grandmother, and one night I remember waking up because I could feel the hair on the back of my head slipping beneath it. I was moving, being dragged actually. Something had me by my ankles and was pulling me towards the closet. I tried desperately to wake my grandparents up, but I was so terrified that only whispers came out. I tried to grab everything I could to stay on the bed, but there wasn't much to grip besides the sheets. I remember the way the wall squeaked as my hand slid across the old gloss paint. As soon as my knees hit the edge of the bed, it let me go. I just laid there, with my legs dangling off the side of the bed, in shock. You would think that a situation like that would keep you up the rest of the night, but I was mentally exhausted. I quickly crawled up to where I was and passed out. I wanted so badly for it to just be a dream. A month later, before ever mentioning it, my uncle came out and told me that he had been dragged off of his bed. He was now regretting ever calling anything to the house. It wasn't a joke anymore. I had nightmares every night, things a 6-year-old shouldn't be dreaming about, and often my nightmares would start after waking up in my grandmother's house. They felt so real, not like sleep paralysis. This was real. I had dreams of my grandparents being shredded into meaty chunks and spread across the bed. I had a dream where I woke up on the couch where I had fallen asleep, and there was a woman on the seat next to me in Victorian clothing. She looked like a rotting corpse, and I can still remember how she sounded when she laughed at me. I had a reoccurring dream of a man in military clothing. I remember his name, but in the dream I couldn't say it, because when I did, this man would get very angry and very violent. I've had dreams of him multiple times. His name was Mr. Walker. But as scary as these nightmares were, none of them will compare to the thing that still haunts my dreams to this day. There is a thing in my grandmother's closet. It's dark and it has no form. It's just a black mess. But this thing is the heart of the house. I've had countless nightmares of it. I left my grandmother's house at 15 because I couldn't take it anymore. For a while, the nightmares stopped, but they've been coming back over the years, and they get worse and worse. It's always the same. I'm dreaming beautifully until I wake up, except I'm not awake, and I'm suddenly aware that I'm not. I'm in my grandmother's house, in her room, and I know better than to look in her closet, but for some reason, I always do. A feeling of terror and dread washes over me. It starts to whisper things to me and laugh at me. I try to pray it away. I beg God for help, but nothing works. I've found ways to drown it out over the years. In my dreams, I started covering my eyes and singing loudly, and then I would wake up. But now it or he's in my head. I can't drown him out anymore. I often yell at him that I'm not scared of him anymore and demand that he leaves, but he knows I'm scared. He thinks it's funny. I clench my eyes together and beg to wake up, but I can't. Sometimes he'll show me my parents and my grandma. Today, he showed me my dog. I would beg them to please wake me up, but they can't, and I can't. I'm stuck in the nightmare until he decides that it's enough. He's chipping away at me. I woke up today feeling exhausted. I woke up today wanting to share this. I've had enough, and I'm going back to my grandmother's house to face this thing.
Number 2.
First off, I was a 24-year-old student attending a Job Corps program in northern Washington state at the time that these stories take place. I was pretty laid back and I don't scare easily. And back then, I didn't put much stock into the paranormal, but I wasn't a skeptic either. I was open-minded, I guess. Anyway, first some background information. This particular Job Corps campus was originally a mental hospital built in 1912. Some of the building was rented out to the Job Corps as classrooms and dormitories. The campus accommodates around 300 students at one time. Behind the dormitory is the main hospital, which sits unused and rarely maintained. It's locked up because of the asbestos and lead paint problems. From day one, we are forbidden to get close to the unused buildings under threat of immediate arrest and expulsion. On the first day, all of the new students go through orientation, which is just a class to explain the program, the rules, and to test out our reading and math skills. During one of these classes, the teacher told us a little history about the hospital, but then the subject turned weird. The teacher told us about how a ghost investigation team had gone into the hospital and investigated it, but that they didn't find anything, so don't go looking for anything, and that we should be alright. After that, she refused to bring the subject up again. I found that to be a little weird, but brushed it off at the time. There are 4 dorms there. The one I was in had 2 floors, boys on the first floor and girls on the second. Being a girl, I lived on the second floor. It's also important to note that the RA's office was on the first floor. The second floor was shaped like a cross. From the bottom, you had the center hall, which had an intersection called T Hall, which branched off to West Hall on the right and East Hall on the left, and a lounge at the top. There are 4 exits. 3 of them are fire escapes which are locked and have alarms on them, and the other is all the way at the end of the center hall. During my first few weeks there, I would always use the West Hall shower room and restroom as they were the largest. But for some reason, students always felt uneasy there. Every time you entered those rooms, you felt like you were being watched by something dark, something that didn't want you there. Fast forward a few months, I became a dorm leader, which has a few perks, including getting your own room. But in exchange, you had to help maintain the dorm and report rule violations. This was around the time that things got weird. It was a holiday and the dorm was almost completely vacant. I was just hanging around my room, doing laundry and catching up on my leadership paperwork. One of my jobs was to hand out incentive points, which is kind of like dorm money. So I leave my room and deliver the said points around the dorm. My last stop was in West Hall. I turned around and started walking back to my room in East Hall when I noticed a girl in T Hall. She had long black hair and was wearing all black. I didn't recognize this girl and figured that she was a visitor. But there was something not quite right about her. So I watched her as I was walking into T Hall. She started walking into East Hall, the same direction that I was headed. As I was passing the lounge, I turned to look into the lounge's window, and it was empty. Then I turned back to see where the girl was headed, but she was gone. I couldn't have looked away for more than 2 seconds. Also, the one thing about my dorm is that every single door has a loud squeak when you open it, loud enough to be heard in all corners of that floor. Also, every door had a keypad, and the buttons click loudly when you press them. I stood in the doorway to East Hall, trying to figure out where that girl could have gone. There is only one exit, and I'm standing in it. You might be thinking, who cares? She's probably just visiting someone in their room, right? The problem is, no one is allowed to go into other people's rooms. That is one of the major rules of the dorm. But more importantly, all of the people in East Hall were gone for the holidays. As a dorm leader, it was my job to uphold the rules. So I stood there, straining my ears for any clue as to where the girl had gone. After about 15 minutes, there was nothing. So I stayed in the doorway, pulled out my cell phone and called the RA. The RA is a paid employee who manages the dorm, hands out mail, checks in visitors and upholds the rules. So I called the RA, and luckily it was Julie, whom I'm friends with. I asked her if she had checked in any guests today. She replied that she hadn't and that the dorm was dead today. I told her that there was a strange girl up in East Hall and asked if she would come do a security check. I stayed in the doorway the entire time. Julie came up and she went around to each room and looked inside. She checked the showers and the restroom, but no one was there. Lastly, she got to my room, but again, no one was inside. That's when I noticed Julie was making a weird face, like she was worried and scared at the same time. She then rechecked the rooms top to bottom and checked the fire escape, which has an alarm on it, but it was locked and the alarm was set. We gave each other a what the hell look. How could a girl just disappear in a dead-end hallway on the second floor? By now, Julie had decided to check all of the rooms on that floor. I stood in T Hall while Julie searched the other rooms. You could see everything from T Hall. We never found the girl, so all we could do was shrug it off. A few weeks after the girl in black incident, I had put it out of my mind and mostly had forgotten about it. That was until weird things started happening in the West Hall's restroom. A few things you need to know about West Hall's restroom. There are 4 toilets and they all share a large tank. 2 toilets in the front and 2 toilets in the back. If you want to reach the back toilets, you have to walk past the ones in front and around to the back. I always used the last stall for some reason. Probably because I would have to walk past all of the stalls and know if I was alone or not. Also, it's important to note that the restroom door was squeaky as hell. So you always knew when someone came in. Anyway, it was a weekend, which means the dorm is dead again. I went into the restroom and, for obvious reasons, walked past the empty stalls to the last one. Because I was alone, I was in no hurry. After a minute, I hear this weird metallic clicking sound. My first thought was, how the hell did someone sneak their way in here? After about 30 seconds of listening to that clicking, I figured someone was screwing with me, so I said, "Is somebody here?" The clicking stopped. I asked again, "Hey, is somebody in here or what?" There was a loud bang, followed by what sounded like something scraping metal. The scraping sound then moved into the stall next to mine. I must have yelled, "What the hell?" That's when I noticed movement to my left. The trash box hanging on the wall was slowly turning upside down, all of its contents falling out onto the floor. I just stared at it in disbelief. I don't think I was even registering what was going on. The trash box just hung there, upside down for a few seconds, until it just dropped, swinging into place. Needless to say, I noped the fuck out of there. I waited about an hour before I went back in to figure out what had happened. All of the trash boxes had been emptied onto the floor in each of the stalls. I cleaned up the trash as it was part of my job, but I eventually figured out what the sounds were. The clicking was the trash box lid being opened and closed, and the scraping was the trash boxes being turned upside down. I did report the incident to the RA, who was Julie again, and she made that weird face again, like she was both scared and worried. She just told me, I don't know what to tell you. Then she wrote me some incentive points and thanked me for picking up the trash. I even told my trade boss about this one. He gave me this weird look and then proceeded to give me some bullshit about the Earth's rotation and yada yada yada, and told me to not bring it up again. My third weird experience worth telling happened in, that same damn restroom. I sure as hell didn't want to use the ones in West Hall, so I didn't have a lot of choice. Anyway, it was another dead weekend and I went to use the same back stall. I'd been in there for less than a minute when, I shit you not, a loud sobbing came from the empty stall right next to mine. Had I not already been on the toilet, I probably still would have shit myself. The sobbing was definitely female, and it sounded like the kind of sob like it was the end of the world or something. Just really tragic. I know that I was alone in there. All of the stalls were empty when I came in. I admit I was really PMSing that day and wasn't in any mood for paranormal shit. I just sat there trying to ignore it, but the crying just kept getting louder. Finally, I just spoke up and said, "What's the matter? Just tell me already." Nothing. The sobbing noise just continued. I was starting to get agitated, but I repeated myself. "What's the matter? Just tell me already." Again, the sobs just continued. I stood up on the toilet seat and looked into the other stalls to confirm that no one was in the restroom with me. It was just me and this disembodied crying. My PMS finally took over and I yelled in a commanding voice, "If you're not going to tell me what's wrong, then shut the fuck up and leave me alone." And as quick as flipping a light switch, the crying had stopped. I think that the only reason I wasn't scared was because I was just so damn angry. I searched that bathroom top to bottom and I found nothing. Honestly, I wasn't really expecting to. So much weird shit had been going on that it was becoming commonplace. Julie was working the graveyard shift that night, so again, I went and told her about it. And again, she gave me her weird look and told me, "I don't know what to tell you." Then Julie asked me if I'd seen her doing bed checks last night at around 3 a.m. I told her no, but asked why. She just sat there, staring at her desk, before she excused herself with needing to do her rounds. A couple of months later, I graduated, returned home for a couple of weeks, and returned with my family for the graduation ceremony. Only a quarter of the students who enroll ever make it to the graduation, so it was a big deal to attend. Most of the staff attended as well, including Julie, who didn't have to work that day. After the ceremony, my family left me to go to the campus. So, I went to my trades workshop. I spent some time saying goodbye to my friends for the last time and meeting the newbies to my trade. After about half an hour, I noticed Julie had walked in and she was waving me over to her. She was acting kind of odd, but I brushed it off as I wanted to say goodbye to her too. She didn't say anything at first, but kept looking over my shoulder. She pulled me to an empty classroom where she sat down in one of the empty chairs. I sat down too. She looked over my shoulder for the 5th time, then leaned in and asked me if I remembered all of that paranormal stuff I had told her. Hell yes, I remember. Who could have forgotten that? I said. I remember the hair on my arm stood up. No one wanted to talk about this, so why was she bringing it up now? She looked me dead in the eyes and proceeded to tell me that I wasn't the first or last person to report weird stuff happening on campus, let alone the dorm. She apologized for not talking to me about the reports at the time. She looked over my shoulder again before telling me that all of the campus staff had to sign orders preventing them from talking about weird stuff happening on campus. If she had discussed or repeated anything about the paranormal happenings on campus, she would have lost her job, and that the only reason she was telling me now was because I wasn't a student anymore. She then asked me if I remembered the time she had asked me about her doing bed checks at 3 a.m. I told her I did. She shook her head and then told me how she was getting reports from students asking her why she would stand at the foot of their beds and stare at them at night time. It always happened around 3 a.m. The problem was, Julie didn't conduct bed checks until 2 a.m. Julie told me more stories about other students, even students from other dorms, but let's stop here. I don't want to tell stories that I wasn't a witness to. Also, after I graduated, I did a little research into the history of the hospital, and I managed to find out more about the paranormal investigation. Ever hear of the TV show Ghost Hunters? Yeah, it was them who investigated the hospital, and they did find evidence of strange things going on. You can find the episode floating around on YouTube. It's Season 3, Episode 13, Northern State Hospital. All I can say is that I left that school believing in the paranormal a little more than when I had first arrived.
Number 1.
I am a 22-year-old male from America's heartland. I am currently a 4th-year electrical engineering student, and this is my 3rd year when most of this story occurred. I am an agnostic and never really put my faith in anything but math and science. But ever since the events the following story entails, it has shaken my understanding of what is sane and what rational science is. These events started in the mid-spring of 2015 till about 2 months ago, which, when I wrote this story, was May 2016. This last month, I started listening to Busta's channel during work and thought it would be a good place for my tale to be told. I'm still unsure if this whole thing was a series of hallucinations or if they actually occurred, but for the sake of my reputation in my studies, I've chosen to remain anonymous, referring to myself as R, and omitting or altering the names of those involved with the events. This is a long story, but because I kept a journal throughout the whole ordeal, instead of fearing my paranormal creatures, I attempted to study them. Though my notes and results are inconclusive at best, the implications are chilling, to say the least. Maybe some people, if a paranormal phenomenon truly has occurred to them, they might find comfort in my findings, or they might find more terrifying horrors than they would care to know. It all started one night in the spring of 2015. I was driving home from a tutoring session that evening. My ego had grown due to the satisfaction that after weeks of tutoring this particular client, I was finally starting to get calculus concepts through to him. Granted, this is not an easy subject to understand, let alone teach, but one of my professors saw that my understanding of the subject was abnormally high and suggested I take up tutoring some of the other students in calculus to make some extra cash. I was apprehensive at first, but soon found a sort of pride from teaching it. Though I ended up teaching more basic algebra than calculus, I still found myself enjoying the job a lot more than I expected to. Nights like this one, where my client made significant progress, was particularly enjoyable. As I was stroking my ego, as I typically do after a good session, I had my thoughts interrupted by the sudden loud noise of tires skidding and darkness encompassing my vision. The next thing I knew, darkness turned to giant spots of colour clouding my vision. The spots gradually deteriorated into the silhouette of a woman that slowly gained more distinct features. She was yelling at me through my now bloodstained but somehow still intact window. "The ambulance is on its way. Hang in there, sir," is what I later determined she said. At the moment, I was rather confused and my ears would not stop ringing, the ethereal blobs still present in my vision. Blood was flowing down my face. I must have hit my head on the car window. Running more on instinct rather than logic, dazed and disorientated, I fumbled to open the door, which would not give. I then removed my seatbelt and started kicking the door. In hindsight, I think the woman was yelling at me to stop and wait for the paramedics. But my ears were still ringing and my head hurt so bad I could only hear muffled noises. The door finally gave and I stumbled out onto the road just when the paramedics started to pull into the scene. One of them saw me and practically jumped out of the ambulance before it had even stopped moving and ran right at me. He ordered me to stop moving in case I had spinal injury. I just stood there, dumbly looking around me at my car, which had been T-boned by what I could only assume was the woman's car. I had been going through an intersection where there were only 2 stop signs that were in the direction the woman was heading. This intersection was notorious for accidents due to the stop signs being blocked by trees, making them hard to see. There were a few onlookers who were eyeing the scene from the nearby houses and passing cars. But upon seeing that both drivers were alright, they soon lost interest and began to disperse. Looking back now, when I was in the streetlights, the spots in my vision had now turned into amorphous blobs of discoloration, barely noticeable in my sight. Before I knew it, the paramedics had me in a neck brace and stretcher and were asking me questions. Sir, what is your name? Can you tell me your name?" the paramedic asked. I answered him. "My name is R." He shined a light in my eyes. "It looks like you have a concussion, R," he said moments later. "We're going to take you to the hospital to make sure you're okay." They then loaded me up into the ambulance and whisked me away to the hospital. On the way there, they asked me more questions, to which I started giving irritated answers and responded spitefully. "How are you feeling?" the paramedic asked, to which I bitterly responded, "Like I just got T-boned." They poked and prodded me with tests and scans, which determined I came out of the crash with a broken rib and a few cracked ones, a concussion, 3 stitches on my head and quite a few bruises. All in all, I think I got out of that car accident relatively unharmed. They wanted to keep me overnight for observation, but they said I would be free to go in the morning. This overnight hospital stay turned into a week-long one because later that night they found an abnormality in my MRI. Apparently, a certain region of my brain, I don't remember which one, was experiencing a large amount of blood flow, and they wanted to make sure that it would not hemorrhage or something. It was during the first night at the hospital that I noticed that the spots in my vision had not gone away yet. They would not appear until the hospital room I was in was sufficiently dark, and they would only appear in dark places around the room, which is why it took me so long to realize that they had not subsided yet. I informed the nurses about this and they didn't seem too concerned about it. When my doctor eventually came by to check up on me, he said it was probably just a side effect of the unusual brain activity. In the evening of my second night in the hospital, my parents had just left for the night after informing me of my car situation. Apparently, the woman who had been outside my window was texting while she was driving and hadn't noticed the stop sign at the intersection where she T-boned me. Her insurance would thankfully cover most of the damage to my car. After my parents left, I just laid there in the dark hospital room. It was around 9 p.m. I couldn't sleep for some reason. I think my roommate, George, had something to do with it. He was an elderly man, late 50s, early 60s, who was there for a heart attack, I think. Whatever the reason he was in the hospital for, he was snoring unbelievably loudly. So I just sat there in the dark room staring at the blobs that invaded my vision. The more I stared at them, the more bizarre they seemed. They started to seem sharper, taking on a third dimension, looking more like the contents of a lava lamp than ghostly clouds now. They varied in size and glowed faint colours, most of which were white or orange, but with yellow, blue, green, red and purple ones scattered about. They were translucent enough to see what was behind them, but solid enough to make out their amorphous form. They seemed to move somewhat slowly but deliberately, constantly absorbing and expelling each other as they phased in and out of the room through the walls. They never seemed to stop moving, maintaining a slow but constant speed. They ranged in size from a few centimeters to 2 meters in length. There was a sort of serene beauty to them, like jellyfish. Eventually I noticed one of the larger blobs started to become stationary, and as it slowed itself, it began to rapidly pulsate and congeal. It started to become darker and darker until it was blacker than the blackest shadow in the room. At some point, it became independent from the other blobs. It looked more solid. I watched the blob gradually change into the silhouette of a man who was terrifyingly familiar, whose outline I could just make out from the cracks of light that trickled into the room from the main hallway. Something I should mention before I go much further is that years ago I was plagued with sleep paralysis and its subsequent shadowy spectres, commonly known as shadow people, and I was very familiar with them. I hear these stories online about the shadow people and how they kill people in their sleep and induce terror upon their victims. To me, this was nonsense and even laughable. The shadow people were not this supernatural entity beyond reason or explanation. They were a side effect of a chemical imbalance in the brain, an imbalance that I had learned to correct. Back in my early teens, I was constantly harassed by the spectres. I would be visited by them at least 2 or 3 times a week, and back then I feared them. But after doing some research on the phenomenon, I developed a theory to dispel the sleep paralysis and the accursed spectres. The theory was sound. The chemical imbalance causes a lingering effect of hormone that the brain secretes during sleep to make sure the body does not move too much. When there is too much of this hormone, the brain tries to normalize itself, which often causes the individual to become semi-conscious. When this does not fix the imbalance, the brain releases adrenaline to try and expedite the process, which causes the paranoia that leads to the hallucinations which are manifested into human shape. So I thought that if I needed to regulate the adrenaline, I could do this by getting more exercise during the day. So I took up kendo, a Japanese sword fighting style that I fell in love with almost immediately. Over the course of months, the sleep paralysis became less and less severe. The paralysis would start, as it usually did for myself and many others, who would wake up with a sense of terror and dread that intensifies when you see a silhouette of a man at the end of the bed. As the silhouette creeps closer for what seems like hours, the person's chest would get tighter as if something was pressing on it, until they eventually awoke. But where the experience started to change for me is eventually I was able to move my fingers. Then I would wish I had something to fight the shadow with. Surely enough, a shinoi or a kendo practice sword would appear in my hand. Upon the appearance of the shinoi, many sensations would occur. I would suddenly realize that it was not a shinoi. Over the months of practicing kendo, my sensei had me doing drills over and over again. I got very familiar with the feel and weight of a shinoi, so much so that it became ingrained in my subconscious. And in my unconscious state, my subconscious knew something was off. The dream shinoi had no weight to it, but I knew in my unconscious mind that I should have some weight to it. This logical paradox would turn the night terror into a lucid dream and would allow me to attack the shadow people, which typically resulted in me awakening in my empty bedroom. I believe now that this was a memory my brain conjured up, personifying its nocturnal chemical struggle into the form of something familiar. Eventually, I no longer see the shadow people, and only have them return when I was under a lot of stress, and I would dispel them easily. Up until this point, this was the closest thing to a supernatural event I had ever gotten, and with logic and science, I beat it. From then on, I held a firm belief that there was no such thing as the supernatural, but only phenomena that had yet to be fully understood, which is what made what occurred next so terrifying for me. What appeared in front of me was undoubtedly a shadow person. I did not feel that overpowering sense of dread or terror which, even in my lucid dream encounters, I would feel for a brief period. I also had no hint of paralysis. I could move just fine. I watched the shadow intensely as it slowly crept across the room. I soon realized that it was not heading for me. It was heading for my roommate, the old man, George. It was then that I realized the old man had stopped snoring and was now making a sort of weak choking, gurgling noise. As the shadow crept behind the curtain divider, I slowly got up out of bed and grabbed my IV drip. I slowly and quietly pulled back the curtain that divided his bed from mine. The old man was staring directly at the shadow. His eyes were so wide they looked likely to pop right out of their sockets. His mouth was gaping open like he was gasping for air. His body looked like it was starting to convulse, and somehow the machine monitoring his heart only seemed to increase its beeps slightly, when it seemed like it should be going crazy. Seeing as how it had been years since I needed to call upon my methods to fight the night terrors, I did not find my lack of shinoi too out of the ordinary, though I was pretty sure I was still having a dream. A really realistic dream that was probably caused by some drug in my IV drip. I tore the IV out and the sensors that were taped onto me. I yelled at the shadow, "Get away, you fucking shadow prick!" The shadow paused as if it was startled. Then, despite having no discernible face, I felt it turn its gaze towards me. That familiar sense of terror, common with sleep paralysis, washed over me, but I wasn't about to back down. I took up a wobbly fighting stance. It started to advance towards me, slowly. As it did so, what I can only compare to its arms and legs grew much longer. When I got in range, I let loose a punch, expecting it to dispel the shadow and cause me to wake back up in my hospital bed. But what happened made my heart sink. My fist hit the shadow. It was solid. It had mass. It could not have been more than a few milliseconds of me just standing there, dumbstruck, with the shadow glaring at me with its faceless intense hatred. But it felt like eons. Suddenly, the door to the room flew open. The second the light hit the shadow, it seemed to move with unreal speed into the darkest shadows in the room. Before I could do anything, I had two really pissed off nurses on top of me. The nurses started ushering me back to my bed, nagging me that I can't be getting up, or tear out my IV. I was completely dumbstruck. Was I hallucinating? How could I feel it? Did this thing have to do with brain injury? Could it be making me feel and see things that are not really there? The old man, in a trembling, weak voice, asked the nurses to turn the lights on. As they did, I saw the shadow for a brief second in the corner of the room before it vanished. This made my racing thoughts stop abruptly. After the nurses started to leave, the old man insisted that they keep the lights on. Before they could protest on my behalf, I weakly told the nurses that it was fine. They shrugged and left the room. It was then that I looked over at the old man, who stared at me with a look of pure dread. He then said something that rocked me to my very core. It terrified me more than anything else that just transpired, and called into question everything I believed to be sane about the world. I saw it too. The rest of the night, my mind was spinning. What was that? A dream? A hallucination? How did George see it too? Could that have actually been a shadow person? Did those blobs I was seeing before the shadow appeared have something to do with it? Am I going mad? After about a half hour, I demanded George tell me what he saw, thinking it would help me to rationalize this. But it didn't. George recited the events exactly as I recalled how they transpired. There was only one thing I could determine that night before somehow falling asleep. I need answers, and I'm going to find them. Unbeknownst to me at the time, I was about to open Pandora's box.